Put your fingers over your lips, people. You're not ready. Early.
Well, good afternoon, boys and girls. Good afternoon. Well, I'll tell you. Well, I am the police chief, and I've been the police chief for 32 years. Now, that's older than your teachers or anything, and I've been around all those years. And Halloween time is coming, so I'm going to tell you something about the history of Novi, and I'm going to include some ghost stories. Remember, these are just stories. We don't believe in ghosts, do we? No. Okay. I'll tell you those stories a little later. Todd wants me to put this on, and I think I'll do it. So, well, it's a microphone, you're right, and that's part of the modern techniques. Okay, this is the history of Novi. Where are we right now? Novi. We're in the city of Novi. Was there always a city of Novi? No. This was just woods, and we had some Indians here. Not so much in this part of Novi, although I can remember the boys and girls finding arrowheads in the fields right around where this school is now. And you might find they're still finding them. Most of the Indians camped around Wall Lake. And do you all know that most of Wall Lake is in the city of Novi? Yeah, okay, that's great. I see you've really gotten a good education here. So we had Indians camping in Wall Lake. And then in 1825, the first settler came to Novi. And at 10 Mile and Haggerty Road, he cleared the land, cut down the trees, and built a log cabin. That was the home of our first settler in what is now the city of Novi. Novi at that time did not exist. Nobody had ever heard the word. There were two townships in Oakland County. The north half of the county was Oakland Township. The south, where we are now, was Bloomfield Township. In 1832, about 7 or 8 years after the first settler arrived, the state legislature split Oakland County in 5 townships. And the one down here was called Farmington Township. Novi was just part of Farmington Township until 1835. Now that's a lot of years ago. The people wanted to separate and have their own community. So they decided to form a separate township. This, where we're now, was called West Farmington. That's a long name to write, isn't it? West Farmington? So they wanted the new name to be something short and easy. Well, there's a lot of stories as to how Novi got its name. I think you've all heard them. You see this number 6 that has been on our police cars and our badges for 32 years? Tollgate 6 on the Detroit and Howell Plank Road. The farmers used to pull up in their wagons and pay their penny a mile and team, remember it was horse and wagons then, team into Detroit. Novi was Tollgate 6, but that isn't where the name came from. That was coincidental, because Novi was named 60 years before there was ever a toll road. It was named from a little town in Italy on the shores of the Bay of Naples, Novi, which in Latin means nothing, or the end of the world. There's some very interesting translations of what Novi means, but Novi was named Novi because they decided they didn't want a name longer than 6 letters. They were tired of writing West Farmington. So what do we have then? We had the township of Novi. Other settlers had arrived, and as the years rolled by, we had a nice farming community. There was no industry. The first industry was a cheese factory, and it's located down near where Grand River and Novi Road meet today. The name of that first white settler in Novi in the spring of 1825 was Erasmus Ingersoll. There's none of the Ingersoll families and their descendants left here, but the next settlers were called the Roots, R-O-O-T. The Root farm was at Grand River, ran from Grand River back to Taft and 11 Mile, and the farm home, and I remember it, was on the southwest corner of 11 Mile and Taft. And that's not too far from us here, is it? It's right up there in the corner, isn't it? Yeah.
That would be where 76 Park is.
Where what is?
76 Park.
That is correct. 76 Park is there. That was the home of the Roots. I remember old Mr. Root, who was the grandson of the original settler there, and his daughter, Rowena, became a teacher in the Novi school. The school over there on Novi Road, just north of Grand River. They only went up to 8th grade. There was no high school then. And there was 10 one-room schools in Novi when I started. Well, there was 8. There was 2 abandoned. 2 of them had been taken into the Northville School District. Okay, she taught school there for many years, married our first fire chief. His name was Glenn Sallow. As part of her work to become a qualified teacher in 1960, she had to get her master's degree, and she wrote this history of Novi here, which is an excellent history up to 1960. And anybody that's interested can get it at the Novi Library. It's the story of Novi's development by Rowena Sallow, who has been retired for many years from the Novi school system. So they didn't have any schools then like we're sitting in now. They had one-room schools. And how many grades in those one rooms? 8. Then later on, they built the Novi Elementary School. In fact, in 1955, we had a bond issue to add those 10 classrooms. And then everybody was separated into various grades. But they were still went to Northville, Farmington, or Wall Lake to go to high school. The township of Novi slowly grew, and in 1955, 30 years ago, the township was a 36 square mile township, and Wixom Road, how many know where Wixom Road is? Everybody. Well, Wixom Road, there were 10 farms along Wixom Road, and that was in Novi. There wasn't any Wixom then. One of those farms had 20 acres, and it was owned by one of our policemen. I'm going to tell you about the fire and police departments later. One day, a man drove in his drive with a big Lincoln. He said, "I'd like to buy your 20 acres. I want to put a tree farm here." Well, this policeman, whose name is Vic Noble, he's retired. He's living in Scotland today. He's over 90 years old. He was smart. He ran down to the township supervisor, Fraser Stamen. He said, "A man wants to buy my 20 acres for a tree farm." Fraser said, "Don't sell. I understand Ford Motor is going to option all the property." Ford Motor did. They bought his farm. They bought all the other farmers' farms. And then they gave the Novi Fire Department, and I was in charge of it in those days, permission to burn down all the barns and all the houses as part of our training. So twice a week we went up there and we burned a barn or a house. And it would illuminate the sky. We had to stop traffic. We also burned Vic Noble's house, one of our policemen. And he was directing traffic down at Grand River and Novi Road, and somebody that didn't know was training came by and said, "Dick, your house is on fire." He said, "Yes, I know, isn't that too bad?" But after we got all the houses burned, then the big machines came in, cleared the land, and they built what? Railroad track. Well, they did build you're right, they did bring a railroad track in there. Why did they bring the railroad track in? So the trains could get into the plant they built, which is the Ford plant, the Lincoln plant out there, and it paid all kinds of taxes to the township of Novi. Then the people there, when they see all this money, they decided they'd take that part of the section out of the township of Novi and create the village of Wixom. So that's what they did. That was formerly part of Novi, now it's the city of Wixom. First they became a village, and then a city. Well, then the rest of Novi Township got worried. Maybe the rest of it would disappear. So they all got together in 1957, and they voted in the village of Novi. And the village of Novi was the biggest incorporated village in Michigan. It was Michigan's biggest village. It was also the third biggest of any of the communities in Michigan in area. First was Detroit, next was then Livonia, and then Novi. And that was the village of Novi. And the village of Novi started to grow. Businesses came in, people came in. I have a little, if I can find it in here, I had it a moment ago, here it is, a little kind of brief history, some notes I made. Now the village of Novi covered 32 square miles, including from almost the top of Wall Lake all the way down to 8 Mile Road. And everything was fine, except then it developed that Northville wanted to move in and take some of the village of Novi, annex it. You might know what annexation is? That means when one community wants to take over part of another. Well, a city can always take over part of a village or a township, but nobody can touch a city. So Northville did reach in and grab a couple of miles down there. So the rest of the people of the village of Novi, what did they do? No, they stayed, but what else would they do? What? They became a city, that's right. And when did Novi become a city? In 1969. So here's the city of Novi. We're a city now, and nobody can annex any part of Novi because Novi is a city. And one of the good things about a city is that it's able to pass its own laws. It doesn't have to depend on state laws. It's able to spend its own money. It's able to build libraries. It's able to do a lot of things a township or a village can't. If you live in a village, as we did here, the village of Novi lasted from 1957 till 1969. And we found out there was a lot of things we couldn't do. Now, what grades are all the children here in? Are they? Third and fourth. All right, I'm going to skip a lot of the statistics, and we're going to get into the history now of the Novi Fire Department. When the first settler built that log cabin, what do they burn in their stoves? Wood. And what happens when you burn wood in a log cabin and the sparks come out of the chimney? The houses will always catch fire because the roofs were wooden shingles. They didn't have the shingles we have today. The sparks would come out of the chimney and the houses would catch fire. The neighbors would all grab buckets and they'd form a bucket brigade from the Ingersoll Creek. And they'd pass the buckets from hand to hand. Sometimes they got those roofs out. Most of the time they didn't. Then as Novi became strictly farm country with these huge barns, they'd go and cut the hay and put it in the barns, and the hay would catch fire and the barns would go. So this was going on for years. In 1928, they decided what Novi needed was a what? Fire department. So they all got together and they raised $800 and they bought a 1928 Rio fire engine. Had an open cab, and that was Novi's first fire engine. Then they got together and they elected a fire chief who was Walter Tuck. And there's still a lot of Tucks around Novi. He was the first fire chief. He also owned the garage down at Novi Road and Grand River. And when there was a fire, they would call the garage, and he would write a note, barn on fire, 9 Mile Road at Meadowbrook, and he'd put it on the telephone pole out in front, and they'd blow a little siren they had, and all the firemen worked around the corner there. They were blacksmiths or did something. He'd leave in the fire engine, and the rest of them would jump in their Model T Fords, and they'd meet him at the fire. Now, when they got to the fire, remember, there was no hydrants, was there? Because there was no water system in Novi. Where did the water come to fight the fire? Where? Where? That's right. We'd drive that fire engine, and I drove it, that 1929 engine. We'd drive that engine right up to a pond, a creek, or a stream. We'd take a big hose from the front of the engine, and we'd hook it up to the engine, and then we'd start pumping water into the engine and out through the fire hose. Well, if it was a muddy creek or muddy stream, we'd put a bucket over the end of that big suction hose so that mud and rocks and fish wouldn't get in our fire engine. We didn't get that bucket on there right away. The pump would stop, the water would start coming out of the hose, and there'd go the house. And we're trying to clean the mud out of the pump. Okay, that was the fire department. One engine, volunteers, no radios. The fire whistle let us know there was a fire. To find out where it is, we'd have to go down to the fire. Later on, they built a fire station. I'll tell you about that later. We bought a brand new American LaFrance fire engine, 12 cylinders, carried a huge tank of water right with it. When we went to the fire then, you had water from the tank of this truck. A little later on, bought another truck, a 1,000-gallon tanker. And all three engines, we still used the Rio. We used that until 1960. We had a Rio, the big LaFrance, we bought a Chevrolet and a Ford. And all those four engines went to every fire. Now, the township built a new township hall on the corner, well, not on the corner, but on Grand River and Novi Road, on Novi Road just south of Grand River. How many have noticed that building there? It used to be a fire station. Oh, most of you have. Okay, on the roof of that, we put a huge siren. And there was one telephone line in Novi that went to the fire department. That was Northville 705. So when you wanted the fire, you dialed Northville 705. And upstairs, we had a family living. And they got rent-free. They got rent-free because all they had to do was pick up that phone and say, Novi Fire Department, when it rang. My barn's on fire. I'm at 10 Mile and Wixom Road. So they'd immediately push a button, the siren would blow, and whatever family member answered that call would run downstairs. The first fireman that came in, you got a barn on fire, 10 Mile and Wixom Road. So the fireman would write it on the blackboard about that side, 10 Mile and Wixom Road. He'd jump in the fire truck and he'd go to the fire. And the others would meet him there. They'd come in, look at the blackboard, and go to the fire. Okay, that's as far as we're going with the fire department, because now I want to start with the police department and how the two of them to this day work together. Until 1954, if you needed the police in Novi, you called the sheriff's office in Pontiac, and a deputy sheriff would come out, or you called the state police, originally in Farmington and later on in Detroit, and a state trooper would arrive. But the state troopers didn't start in until 1920. So from the time Erasmus Ingersoll built his log cabin until 1920, you'd have to call Pontiac for a deputy sheriff. And by the time he got out here, you might as well not have called. The state police started in 1920. The first state policeman killed on duty was shot down here in Novi at the corner of Grand River and Wixom Road. There was a farmer there who was retiring from farming. When they got about 80, 90 years old, they used to quit farming, have a big sale, sell all their plows and so on, and retire. Built a little house down around Novi Road and Grand River. This farmer was retiring, and he had his farm sale that day. Well, it was a Saturday, and he couldn't take the money to the bank till Monday. He looked out the window and he saw a touring car, a big open car parked there with 4 men in it. So he called Farmington and told the state police, I think I'm going to get robbed. Well, the state police came out in an old Model T Ford, and they jumped out of the car with their guns. The 4 men, they jumped out with their guns, and they shot and killed one of the state policemen, wounded the other, and they got away. And that was the first state policeman killed, was killed right here in Novi. Well, as Novi grew, they finally decided they needed their own police force other than the state or the sheriff's department or the elected constable. So they appointed a policeman 32 years ago. That was the first policeman in Novi. Who was he? Does anybody know? Me. That's right. So
said before 32 years.
you're smart. So I'm the first policeman in Novi. I was in charge of myself. I was the chief of one person, myself. And also, remember our firemen were all volunteers. They'd leave their home or their jobs and they'd come to fight the fire. So I was also in charge of the fire department. And I was down at the station there at Grand River and Novi Road. If a fire came, I'd drive the engine. If a police call came, I'd take a police car. But we had no radios in those days. No radios. So, what would happen? If they needed the police at night, they'd turn on a red light at the corner, and I'd see that light, and I'd go to the corner, and I'd call in. Now, there was a lot of action, because we had then what was called the Wall Lake Amusement Park, big roller coasters and slides and airplanes and speedboats. The airplanes were on a cable attached to a tower, and around these airplanes would go. You could see them lit up for miles at night. Across the street was the Wall Lake Casino. It was a very popular place. The big dance bands were there, hundreds of people every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We had all kinds of traffic. There was no freeway then. Immediately, the township decided we needed 2 policemen, because I used to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, always available. Because if I wasn't there, there wasn't anybody, and it might take an hour or 2 hours for the state police or the sheriffs to arrive. They hired a second policeman, and then we got a radio. But the radio only went one way. They could call us. We wouldn't talk back. We couldn't. So if we weren't in the car when that call came in, we missed it. And later on, we got 2-way radio. We could talk back and forth. Later on, we started hiring people to sit right there in the police station and answer the phone for the police calls and the fire calls and put it out to us on the radio. Then we put radios in the fire engines. And by the time Novi became a village, we had 4 policemen. By the time Novi became a city, we had 20. We have 32 policemen now. When Novi formed its fire department, we had 1 fire station. How many do we have now? 4. Okay, this is a sharp class. How much more time do I have?
Would you tell specials?
I told we'd be a couple minutes late.
Yeah, we really don't, we have just a few minutes.
All right, we're going to wind this up as rapidly as I can by mentioning that we've had a lot of action in Novi. We've had big fires. We've had murders. We've had shootings. However, if you want to think about it, they're spread out so far apart that it is really one of the safest communities, both from the side of the criminals and the fires. We have an excellent fire department today. The police department still gets the fire calls. We get the calls and we send the fire trucks, but it's completely independent. They have their own chief now, an assistant chief, a lot of fine volunteer firemen. How many of you kids know anybody that's a fireman here? Oh, wow. Look at that.
One of our students' father is a volunteer fireman.
Who is that? Well, you can tell him you heard all about the early days of the Novi Fire Department when we had 1 engine from one of the guys that was really a fireman in those days. And that was long before your father probably was born. Okay, yeah?
I have a question. Do you know how they got the first doctor?
The first doctor in Novi?
Yeah.
Well, the first doctor, actually, it was his wife that suggested the name Novi. And if you're interested in that doctor's name, it's in Mrs. Sallow's history book. And his name, and I don't remember it because he was gone long before I arrived, the first doctor I remember was Dr. Holcomb. And then after Dr. Holcomb retired, we had no doctor for many, many years until 1956 when Lyle Fettig came to Novi. Incidentally, there were no banks in Novi, no attorneys, no dial phones. This was one of the last communities that stopped using the old phones where you picked it up and the operator would say, "Number, please," and you'd give her the number. The first doctor, and I'm going to get his name for you because it's in here, because it was his wife that suggested the name Novi. Remember, the first settler was Ingersoll, and they had the meeting at his home. And the doctor's name is, and we're getting there, Dr. J.C. Emery, who, at the suggestion of his wife, proposed the name Novi because it was easily written, easily spelled, and yet not a common name. Once they hear it, he said, people will remember it. Now, up in Lansing, when the name was sent up there for the, just a second, I'll answer it. When the name was set up there to be officially recognized, one of the senators said, "The name Novi is very unfit and inappropriate." Novi, he said, meant not known, unknown, or forgotten in Latin, and he objected to the name. Nevertheless, it was adopted, and in the fall of 1832, Novi became Novi. And the first doctor did very well. He had a lot of injuries to treat, axes, saws. In one instance, a lady had to kill a bear with an axe at the corner of Napier and 10 Mile, and she got cut by the bear claws, and he treated those. And what was your question?
When the fire started, did you always, when you got there, did you always put, like when you got there, when you put them out, did you always, sometimes you have to get, right after that, then you had to have another call in.
Yeah, that happened one time with the Rio. Now, we carried 500 gallons of water on it. We went to this farmhouse. Barn was on fire, and we put it out. We went back on Novi Road, and we started to drink some coffee. We did not fill our water tank. We got another call, a Centennial farmhouse on 9 Mile, and in the excitement, we forgot we hadn't filled the tank. So we all jumped on the engine, and we pulled up down there, and no water in the truck, the house blazing. The phone line was still up, ran in and called the Northville Volunteer Department and said, "Come up here right away, we need some additional water." They came, but it was too late, yes. Sometimes if you didn't fill your tank after the fire, it was very embarrassing. Now, later on in 1956, we got the first hydrants in Novi. The first hydrants, they had their own water system. That was in Willowbrook. Who knows where Willowbrook is? Hey, y'all do, 10 Mile and Meadowbrook. They put hydrants in. Nowhere else in Novi were there hydrants. The first fire I had down there was one night, 1956. One of the new houses caught fire. They had plastered it, and they had an oil heater in there to dry the plaster out. It caught fire. The police car noticed the flames coming through a window. They called on the radio. I jumped in the big LaFrance, and we went to the fire. There was 3 firemen hanging on the sides of the truck that heard the whistle and came up just as I was pulling out. We got down there, and we pulled up in front of this hydrant. That was the first time we ever hooked up to a hydrant. We had all kinds of trouble. And we did put the fire out, but it was tough. It almost spread to the next house. About 3 weeks later, we had another fire. Same thing, another new house, same plaster. This time we went down there like champs. We got those hydrant connections made. We got that fire out and nothing flat. But and I'll never forget the time the Novi Fire Department ran to their first fire and used a hydrant for the first time in the history of Novi. Today they couldn't operate without the hydrants. They're beautiful. Yeah.
Did you ever have 2 fires at the exact same time?
Yes, we did. We used to, Halloween time, we used to keep the entire fire department on duty because, and I just happened to bring along something that might be interesting if I can find out which book it is. Now, you cut me off when the time comes.
It's so interesting, it's hard to cut you off.
In 1955, I bought the log book for 30 years ago. Halloween in 1955, 30 years ago. All righty, let's see what we had that time. Tell you the type of fires we had and what used to go on Halloween then. Now remember, this was farm country, barns, fields, pumpkins growing right in the fields. They could pick the pumpkin out of the field and throw it to the mailbox or something, and they did. But, okay, here's October 31st, 1955, Halloween. Okay, now the Novi Dispatch, that's Station 17. Here we go at Station 17 to car 1701. Two suspicious cars, Haggerty north of Grand River. 1701, that was at 7:50 at night. 1701 calls back and says, these cars are probably after that advertising covered wagon there. They used to have covered wagons scattered around Detroit, like the pioneers used advertising a car dealer. Halloween, everybody used to steal those covered wagons. They'd drive up, hook them to their bumper, and take off. Put them in school or something. So we sent a police car to stop them. Yeah.
You know, on Halloween, they always used to, like back in the pioneer days, they didn't have any bathrooms and they dig deep holes and there was like a kid named go there, and on Halloween, the people would come by and tip them over.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the way Novi was 30 years ago. Hey, the house next to me, every year, every Halloween, and I got a run right there. They turned over the outhouse. Sure they did. That's common. That's nothing. Absolutely. Okay. The next call. 9 Mile and Novi, straw stack on fire. Right out in the middle of the road. Okay, the fire department's on the way. Okay, here's another one. Oh, then the car calls back, we have apprehended 4 men trying to steal the covered wagon away. You have the names, the station wanted to know. Here's another, next call came in, corn shocks on fire, first farm south of Wixom on Wixom Road. Fire department on the way. You know what a corn shock is?
Yeah.
They stack them all up, you see them around here, maybe you got one in the school here. A stack of corn with the pumpkins around it. Well, these were the actual corn stocked in the field by the farmer. And the kids gathered them all together in one big one and set it on fire. And they gathered it right in the middle of the road. So this one was at first farm south of Wixom on Wixom Road. Corn shocks in the middle of the road on fire. The fire department is now clear. They'll be on the way. Children turning over outhouse. Send firemen home. Send firemen to 2 outhouses on fire. Here's a bunch of calls on soaping windows. I have a lot more calls. Yeah.
Are you still the chief of fire?
No, not since Novi became a city. Then we hired a full-time fire chief. I haven't had anything to do with the fire department since 1969. I was the director. I was in charge. We had an excellent volunteer chief, Fred Loynes. Prior to that, Glenn Sallow, whose husband was the fire chief, the lady that wrote this book. Prior to that, Walt Tuck. But Glenn Sallow was injured on the way to a fire and had to retire. I guess I better quit, right?
Yeah, we really have to go. They have Jim Martin.
Okay, I wanted to tell you a ghost story of old Novi, but I'll tell you that next year. And now, we don't have time, I'll tell you next year, but I'll tell you Halloween night, after midnight, when it's foggy, do not be around Grand River and Novi Road. Why not? You might see something. And if you see this, I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to scare you. Remember, this is just a ghost story. It's not true. If you see a tall woman with a little girl, the little girl is kind of stocky built, the woman is tall and thin, and as they walk towards you, now 3 of my officers have told me this, if you walk towards you through the fog, you'll notice the woman is thin, emaciated, and their clothes are tattered, rotting, and in rags. They walk west on Grand River from Novi Road, only on foggy Halloween nights around the fall of the year, November or October. They walk alongside of a house, up a driveway alongside the house. And if you would, I wouldn't follow them up there, but someday you might look. And there, back of the garage, are their two graves. Sometimes they get out and they walk in October and November in the fog after midnight.
What will they do?
I'm not going to tell you. No, they won't. They won't hurt you. They won't hurt you. They don't exist. Remember, this is a ghost story. They don't exist. And I'll tell you another one about the Old Methodist Church next year.